Well, thanks for having me. That was louder than I expected. Good to be with you guys. Happy to be in this high chair to clearly punish our panelists. And happy National Hangover Day to all of you after the Super Bowl yesterday. If you're a Chiefs fan, hope you're happy. And if you're an Eagles fan, hope you're holding on. Too soon? Too soon? too soon, very sorry. Okay. Well, look, you have two great panels ahead of you. I'm just honored to be part of this first one. Our job is to do a bit of the retrospective. What happened in this past year? We'll do a bit of forward-looking, but want to get everyone up to speed and get the best insight we can give you about what we just witnessed that's been rocking the world for the past year. So I'm going to start with Mike here. You've been, of course, one of the most prominent analysts of this war, and I just want to. I have to be somewhat open-ended, right? Because we're talking about a whole year, and it's hard to get down specifics for the start here. But from my perspective here, it feels like if we're having this conversation, the general overview is Ukraine done pretty well, and if we'd had this conversation about 2 or 3 months ago, we'd have been like Russia underperforming, way worse than we thought, and now still underperforming but learning. Maybe getting a little better. Is that sort of a general encapsulation of where we're at?
So look, the challenge when you're following a war and you're in the midst of it is wars go by phases, right? And I think right now it's best to describe that we have been in a transitional phase. They tend not to end the way they begin. And it's very easy to extrapolate from whatever phase or period of war you're in to assume that that's how it's going to keep going. But often you have things like offensives, you have operational pauses, you have efforts at reconstitution, you have retreats, and you have advances. Right, so after the fall, I think it's fair to say that Ukraine had 2 fairly successful offensive operations. The Russian military was at its most vulnerable heading into the winter. It had a structural deficit of manpower. It had a lot of issues to resolve. And mobilization enabled them to stabilize their lines. It would have taken 3-4 months to see what they really would have been able to make out of the personnel they mobilized. I think at this stage, the Russian military has probably consolidated defenses. It's likely doubled the force presence they have in Ukraine. Withdrawing from Kherson allowed them to substantially reduce their frontage. But they're still at a relative disadvantage. Well, it depends how you assess it. Obviously, advantage is a bit of an abstract notion. Right now, as far as I see it, the Russian military has tried to seize the initiative across Donetsk and Luhansk. They're trying to prosecute an offensive and have been for the last 3 weeks. I've seen a lot of media colleagues been asking, where's the offensive? What does it look like? It started 3 weeks ago. It's just not what a lot of people expect. It should be fairly underwhelming. It's focused on the Donbass. I don't think the Russian military is fully committed to its reserves yet. But this is pretty much it. And so a lot of folks are kind of searching for the thing that is very much in front of them, as best I can tell. And it's a matter of some debate whether Ukraine is best off absorbing this offensive and then launching their own much anticipated offensive in the spring, or what the best course of action is for them. But this is roughly where we are right now. We're about to see what the extent of Russian offensive potential is. I think it's quite circumscribed. But I also suspect that the Russian military is better able to offer a stubborn defense. If you look at what happened in Kherson in the fall, that was a very difficult attritional fight for the Ukrainian military. And it tells us that this year, the biggest challenge will be to offer Ukraine a sufficient relative advantage to conduct offensive operations against the Russian military under the condition that they no longer enjoy a manpower advantage, that the Russian military is entrenched across echelon lines, right, and has solved some of their manpower and other issues. Not all of them, but some of them.
So I want to make sure, Marie, I want to come to you because what Michael sort of described, I mean, part of Ukraine's success has been that Europe has been extremely helpful, right, in this war, perhaps more than even some of the Europeans expected Europe to be. And I think what I'm sort of taking from this past year has been 2 lessons. One, Europe can step up, although one could argue could step up more, part 1. And then part 2 is, and related to the first, it still kind of needs the U.S., right? Even though we have France talking about strategic autonomy and all that, I've talked to French officials, and they will say, yeah, but that's like a long-term thing. Okay, but of course Ukrainians go, great, right? So talk to me about, generally speaking, what you learned about Europe's role in all this in the past year.
In 2 minutes. Thank you to the Stimson Center to welcome me. Over the past year, I will say Europe exactly has done a lot and discovered its own might. Like, not a lot of people a year ago would have said that the EU would do what he has done. And I'm talking like the EU, but also just the European member states and how they've been at the forefront of this. And it's definitely true that, especially in the past few weeks, with the tanks drama with Germany and calling for the US to do it first, otherwise they won't do it, a lot of the conclusion were, at the end, we need US leadership. Like, the Europeans cannot do anything by themselves. And I've been asked of the French people in the think tank, so strategic autonomy is dead, right? And I'm probably more optimistic than this, because I would agree that France never said its strategic autonomy is the state of play. It's not a description, it's an M. And it's also never been about, pushing away the United States. And this is something I think we didn't understand very well here in the United States. So it's not a problem from the French perspective at all that the US are actually committed a lot in Europe. But what has been achieved, I think, in the past year, is actually something on NATO and EU complementarity. Like, before, in the debate when I was at the French Ministry of Defense, it was really a lot of the European partners were talking and say, like, yeah, but if we do more, we will weaken NATO. And I think what we have proven in the past year, despite all the difficulties, is that the EU has put up a EU training mission for the Ukrainian armed forces, delivered for the very first time lethal weapons to Ukraine, which was unthinkable even like 2 years ago. And I'm not speaking about like all the financial, economic aid and everything. And this has not weakened at all NATO. So in that regard, you have progress on strategic autonomy. You have like initiatives and capabilities building that is still inefficient, that Europe is not still doing enough, but it's moving forwards. I think the issue right now is about would Europeans be able to do more if the United States were not pushing them to do so. So it's mixed.
Yeah, a mixed picture about U.S.-Europe relations. Fascinating. Rachel, I'm curious. There's always been talk about sanctions, how much the U.S. uses them, their effectiveness. I mean, sort of on the grand scale, have we learned here that its limits are pretty? Its aims are pretty limited, right? Everyone initially was talking, will these sanctions force Putin to stop or somehow get him deposed? And really, what we're sort of at this point is, well, it's just going to make it harder, hopefully, over time, to allow Russia to continue waging this war. Is that sort of a fair summation of the year?
So I think what we've learned, which arguably we already know, and I've worked on sanctions not as a focus thing, but probably for about 15 years now. Iran was sort of where I started trying to understand and sort of have looked at a number of cases. So I'm just saying it's not just the Russia case, but it's reminded us that we know that large countries, and they can be large in size of GDP, or they can be large in size of critical infrastructure or resources in Russia's case, that it's harder to have an effect. That they're more effective when there's a larger coalition imposing, so that it's not unilateral, which maybe brings us to Marie's point about strategic autonomy and where that is. And that also, but by its nature, they are less effective even from an economic perspective, when there's other countries that are willing to step in. And so I think that's always been an issue where Russia was concerned, and I think we'll get to this question of the role of China, countries like India, but also, in a sense, because of Russia's role in the global economy, there were choices made at the outset to focus to not impact current energy production. We're doing that now, and we are actively, the US and allies are actively trying to reroute energy, but that's really something of the last 3 months. And so from the get-go, but to step back though, I think this question of effectiveness, and as an economist who comes to this, political economist, I think it's always easier to say what might the economic and financial impacts might be. We can still get that wrong. Go back to the ruble is rubble, though that wasn't me that said that. But it's much harder to think about the political impacts. And that's where I think we can look at not only, Russia's stated sort of policy choices going into this, but also other countries that have survived. They might not have thrived. They might be leaving aside economic strategic interests that Western countries might look at cost-benefit analysis and say, well, okay, well, Russia is abandoning their role as reliable supplier, and they're missing opportunities in hydrogen markets, and there can be a whole long list. But this was a country that already was choosing not to invest very much in some areas. So I think that issue of economic impact, yes, and I would say in the last couple of months it's probably been growing. Some of that is because of sanctions choices, but some of it is just the very mobilization costs that Mike talked about at the start. And so when we look at the budget and the budget looks more precarious than it's looked for a while. Now, does that lead to a change in the willingness to engage war? I'm not sure, because you can still look at Russia as a country that came in and said, that with not a lot of debt, with a fair amount of savings and willingness to redeploy. And so I think we've ended up with a Russia that is probably a Russian economy that's smaller, but that is more consolidated, that is maybe more centralized on military. And I think we can look at other regimes, maybe smaller countries. But so I think it makes sense for policymakers to have some humility about not just the effectiveness of sanctions, which I would say are only one of the tools on the table, but also to be aware of the intended and unintended consequences that may result in the adversaries.
And I'm going to ask my last round of completely unfair, open-ended questions to you. Since this war started, basically every U.S. foreign official that talked to me was saying, "Gotta watch out for what China does here." Right? It's going to say a lot about what Beijing is thinking about, how close they really are to Russia, and then there's been all this talk about the no limits partnership, quote unquote. I was in Aspen when the then ambassador Qin Gang said, "No, that's not really true." Now foreign minister. So just kind of help me understand, especially now that we've had that Wall Street Journal reporting of trade data, right, and helping between the two. I mean, what have we learned about China's role in this war? Are we expecting a more involved role down the line?
It depends on which aspect we're talking about. I think economically and especially in terms of trade, we know that China-Russia trade increased somewhere 28-30% last year. And especially in terms of the import, especially the energy import, because the price is just so much higher, right? So the volume may not have increased that much, around 10%, but the value of the Chinese energy import from Russia really has increased a lot. So you could argue that China has been supplying Russia with the financial resources to continue this war. It's revenue creation. And then there's also the export side that the Wall Street Journal article looked into pretty carefully. But with the export data from China to Russia, I think one point that people should pay more attention to is any discussion about quality without discussion about quantity is not fair. So if you look at, yes, China has exported this type of equipment or parts or semiconductor chips to Russia, but if you look at the total value of that or the volume of that, I wouldn't say it's significant. Like $13 million for drones. How many drones is that? Is that really going to change the result of the war? But in terms of the politics, I think one thing is clear, that Beijing is not going to abandon Russia regardless of the result of this war. Because for China, when it looks at world politics, the most significant external threat remains to be the United States. So having Russia there for China is a much more sensible choice than not having Russia as a partner to China. And the Chinese are also concerned that, well, if we turn our back against Russia, then what does that mean for our border? Remember, that's an exceedingly long border. And in the 1960s and 70s, it was the existential threat for China. So that memory is not that remote. And for this year, I expect the economic relations to continue. So there's no incentive for China to stop importing energy from Russia, for example. And China is not the only one. Depending on the price, we could even see further increase of that energy trade. But one thing that people should bear in mind is looking into the long-term trajectory. China's energy dependence on Russia is only going to decrease, because China is looking for carbon emission peak by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. So as China's navigating away from the traditional fossil fuel, I think if you look at the bilateral economic relations, energy really is a primary piece. Once you take that away, what is Russia for China? But the political relationship is still definitely going to continue. We know that the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, is planning a trip to Russia this year. Depending on when it happens, I think the consequence could be, there's going to be a lot of repercussion in terms of China's attempt to improve relations with the United States. We'll see how the balloons go. But when Xi Jinping visits Moscow, then that's going to send a very wrong message to Washington, right? Is China really trying to play neutral in this war? Or maybe China can do something along the trip, like tag along a visit to key European countries, or maybe have a phone call with Zelensky before he goes to Moscow. So there are ways to mitigate the impact. But looking down the road, I don't think China particularly is trying to look for the role of a mediator. Instead, I think it wants to play quiet, be the economic partner of Russia, and not to be put under the spotlight for what Russia is doing, and definitely not to be held responsible by Russia's behavior.
I want to pick up on what you said, because I heard a couple hmms out there, which was, China's not going to abandon Russia, right? So how can it not abandon Russia without sort of getting that spotlight on it?
I think the Chinese believe there is a way to navigate it. Like if you think about right after the war broke out, China was under the spotlight, right? There were a number of New York Times articles saying that China knew and China was the accomplice. But I would say that by summer, that spotlight has already been moved away from China. So the Chinese always say, well, we have a pro-Russia neutrality, which is oxymoronic position. But I think it does reflect the assessment, which is a contradictory assessment of China's own assessment of the geopolitics, which is that China does see the United States as its most significant geopolitical challenge or threat. And in that sense, Russia can play a very helpful role, or at least in the Chinese mind, Russia can. But on the other hand, what Russia has done to Ukraine, no matter how the Chinese try to justify it, it is unacceptable according to international law or the UN Charter that Chinese themselves quote. So it does reflect a contradiction or a conflicted position that China is in. China cannot justify Russia's behavior. But on the other hand, it is not willing to treat Russia as an enemy either, because there's the United States. And if you ask any Chinese strategist, their first response is always going to be, well, when Russia is gone, then we will be the next on the list. So that deeply embedded perception or that conviction is reflected in every step of China's dealing with Russia since the beginning of the war.
Fascinating. We could do a whole more panel on that, but we'll leave that for the second panel probably. Marie, do want to come to you really briefly, and then I'm going to go to Michael on this kind of same general question. I'm going to get more specific as we continue. But as I've been traveling through Europe this past year, I've sort of noticed two things. One, of course, not a new phenomenon here. Those in Eastern Europe far more hawkish on this war than those in the West. And two, I kind of hear differing thoughts on, well, had we sent more of weapons to Ukraine, had more advanced stuff earlier on, maybe Ukraine would be in a better position now. And I'm hearing that more from the East than I am from the West. Talk to me about, you've been in touch with all these officials and familiar with these debates. What was really sort of driving, Europe to be at the position where it's at now in terms of the weapons that it sent, right? And why it didn't want to go further as the Balts especially wanted to go.
Yeah, I think you have indeed a diversity of Europeans here between the UK, between the Western member states and the Central Eastern member states. And, Europe is a patchwork in that regard. So looking maybe more in the West from what I know, and especially France. So I would say in the first few weeks of the war in France, you had the feeling that the assessment that Ukraine would not be able to sustain the attack, and we had to find a ceasefire as soon as possible. And so that was first the aim. And then because of the Russian escalation and the Russian warfare, because it's not just the aggression, it's the war crimes, and that really matters also in the European public opinion, there became the assessment that Ukraine has to win on the battlefield and not just through the negotiations or potential negotiations. And so basically the idea for, at least in the French thinking, about what to deliver to Ukraine and what not, you have three criteria. First, the escalation. France is a nuclear power, as the UK, as the US, and in that regard feels a responsibility, like a specific responsibility, and is pretty careful, and that is always like NATO is a defensive alliance, it's a nuclear alliance, and that's something that we will say a lot for, for you have debate within Europe and also with the United States about like what Russia might or might not do, and you don't have necessary agreements on that. The second point is what the Ukrainian needs, and you can see that throughout the war so far, you had different operational needs and not necessarily the same. And so for France, it was really about listening to the Ukrainian operation needs and providing whatever they could. And the third criteria was really to be as efficient as possible. And so to deliver what was absolutely necessary. And so at the beginning of the war, it was more about, like the Soviet era equipment, and now it's more, we need Western. And for France, it's also very important when they give the capabilities that they keep national capabilities for France. And in Eastern Europe, it's not the same calculus, and they actually blame France or Germany, saying like, this is existential. It's not just for Ukraine, it's for Europe. And so please deplete. And so you have this, all this calculus going in that reflection. And I think this is where the EU has come back. And so trying to help the countries to actually give everything they can and to replenish stocks through EU mechanisms also, like, and it's not necessarily easy, and like turning to countries to replenish or should be like European industrial base, and this is another debate. But this is really how the strategic thinking has been regarding the delivery of weapons.
But Mike, when the French or other European countries basically make that argument to the Ukrainians, they call me and my colleagues and go, weakness, right? That's not enough. They need more advanced weaponry. They need more Western weaponry. And what they tell me and others is basically, had we had fighter jets, tanks, long-range missiles like ATACMS, all that kind of stuff, Ukraine would be in a better position versus Russia than it is today. Is there any sort of validity to that argument coming out of Kyiv?
Had they had it at what point?
Had they had it months earlier?
Months earlier in this war? Months before the war?
Months in this war. I mean, of course, before, whatever, but...
I mean, I love historical counterfactuals, because they allow you to enter this alternate fantasy land where if you multiply the word if sufficiently, all sorts of things are possible, if you just compound the word if, you can just write all sorts of history. So here's the way I look at it. In general, I think over the past year, the United States and Western countries have shown up just in time with military assistance at a lot of Ukraine's worst moments. Could that have been done better, sooner or earlier? Definitely. Is there a complex process to manage the flow of equipment, conduct training, establish what you need to maintain it? Because when these things break down, they have to be pulled back out of the country to Poland, repaired, and what have you. Yes. Is it easy to criticize if you're not involved in that process and you don't know how long anything takes, and you don't know how long it would take to ship this, how long it would take to train them? Absolutely. If you have no idea what you're talking about, it's super easy to criticize the people involved in the process, and that's what DC in some ways is about, right? I'm not involved in it, but I have been in government before, and what I can assess is yes, it probably could have been done sooner. It could have been on a larger scale, and it could have been done earlier. I think probably one of the things that may have deterred provision of military assistance early on in the war was not an assessment of the likelihood of Ukrainian success, but actually a strong privileging of the problem of escalation management, and too much concern about escalation management regarding military assistance early on. I think that might have delayed it by some amount. And I suspect it also took a while to online these processes and to figure out what's best to us in Ukraine. Plus, I also think some parts of the establishment were overly used to working with Afghanistan or Iraq and had the wrong assumptions about how quickly Ukrainians could integrate, could train, to learn to use U.S. military equipment. We're not the only ones that can know how to use artillery or infantry fighting vehicles or various types of armor. Yes, it's different than Soviet generation kit, but nonetheless, I think a lot of folks were surprised how fast Ukrainians could train on it and put it to good use. But I'm not much fond of these counterfactuals. If you could make a counter argument that if in the run-up to the war, it's going to be a bit thorny, but if the run-up to the war, if Ukrainian political leadership wasn't somewhat in denial about the fact that the war was coming and suggested that they were systematically preparing for a Russian military invasion, a lot more could have been done in the months preceding the war than was, as opposed to scrambling to do it after the fact. And that Ukraine could have been in a much better position in terms of the first month and what happened with the initial Russian offensive, as shambolic and as poorly planned as it was. And that's the problem with multiplying ifs.
All right, so another counterfactual since you love them. No, but I mean, one of the things again, this is sort of continuing to hear this, which is, the administration, their line is, we don't want to cross certain red lines with the Russians. If we send, at the time it was like, well, if we send missile defense systems, that's going to cross the red line. If we send tanks, it's going to cross the red line. If the fighter jets go over, that's going to cross the red line. Now it seems like the red line that they are still sort of on is ATACMS. Do you have any sort of indication as to why, one, this administration is getting the sense of like, here's where the Russian red line is, and two, why they keep crossing it?
So I'm not in the administration, I can't help you. You knew that was going to be my answer. I have a question though, why are people so focused on ATACMS? Because before it was HIMARS, then it was tanks, which was important, but I think much more weighted towards the political symbolism and significance of it rather than the relative material impact. We'd already sent Ukraine over 300 tanks last year of Soviet origin. So, and that's all important. Like when it comes to armored fighting vehicles, it's really about quantity. It's a numbers game of generating additional brigades. It to some extent doesn't matter how qualitative superior they are. But now we're on F-16s and then we're on ATACMS. And it's an interesting conversation, but if I can reframe a bit, one of the things that really vexes me is that we are, as a defense community, often technology fetishists, so we like to believe in game changers and silver bullets. But large-scale conventional wars fundamentally come down to attrition, replacement of manpower, material, personnel, defense industrial mobilization, and force reconstitution. And so it's very unlikely that any of these capabilities are going to be game changers. I'll tell you how you know. Here's a good exercise. If you thought one thing was a game changer, like HIMARS, okay, and then after that you think tanks are a game changer, and then you think F-16s are a game changer, and you think ATACMS are a game changer. The fact that you keep looking for game changers is a good indicator that prior game changers weren't the game changers you thought they were going to be. And maybe that's not a good way to think about war in general. Yes, they all contribute. They can contribute to an offensive. Most capabilities have their greatest impact when they're first introduced to the battlefield at scale. Then they typically drive adjustment, adaptation, and they have impact, but it tends to level off to some degree. So I don't have a good answer to you about what the administration thinks about HIMARS, I'm sorry. But I hope, at least some thoughts on how to think about introduction of these kind of capabilities.
No, but you went where I was hoping you'd go, so good. Rachel, I do feel like, since we're in the retrospective panel here, when we're talking about like how people are going to view maybe this first phase of the war, or even just how the West sort of responded, it feels like there's been a ton of attention on sanctions, of course, when we touched that earlier, but the export control section has been arguably the far more important part of this response. Talk to me about what you've seen in terms of the effects of the export control, especially on the technologies headed towards Russia, and what sort of effect do you expect that to have? And do you think, and then, sorry, third part to this question, do you think this could be a replicable playbook for, this kind of kinds of conflicts down the line?
Yeah, so before I answer the good three-part question, and remind me if I miss one of the three parts, I just want to, sort of respond to, I think the way that Mike laid out this sort of game changer, silver bullet kind of question on the military side is also quite relevant to the conversation we're having here on all the economic tools. And that's not only a dynamic of we've sort of securitized and are using economics as a weapon, but there's always this element and this sort of paradox of, on the one hand, some of these economic tools do build over time, but yet at the same time that some of the impacts manifest over time as previous stockpiles are worn down and the like, and new investment doesn't occur or occurs at a greater cost, you also have an adaptation, either new suppliers and the like, and so on. So that rhetoric, I guess all I'm saying is the reason I was nodding along is that that sort of frame becomes useful for what policymakers often think of to some extent as a game of whack-a-mole, occasionally of closing loopholes. You're completely right, Alex, that export controls are such an important part of the toolkit. And I have to sort of say that these days when I use the word sanctions, I'm actually talking about a wide set of economic tools. And in some ways it's interesting because we're sort of going back to dynamic. If we look back 30 years ago, if you read the term economic sanctions, it often meant trade sanctions. Like you read old sort of U.S. trade policy for China, it's really about, or others. And so the move towards targeted financial sanctions was a way of, okay, well, how do you deal with countries where you're not trading, Iran and others? And in some cases, export controls came really very much back into the picture. Actually, even before this, sort of this re-escalation of this phase of the war with Russia, but with the adoption against Huawei of computer chips. And so I guess all I'm saying with that is to say that the lessons we're learning about export controls, we have to both look at how they're impacting or not Russian supply chains, but also the fact that we're using some of these tools at the same time on Chinese and other entities, both to punish and restrict and limit involvement in the Russian military industrial complex, but also for other economic goals vis-a-vis China. And so when I look at the lessons we're learning over the last year, I can't completely separate out the kind of U.S. policy towards China for Chinese competition and U.S. policy towards Russia and to all Russian supporters. So, but export controls, I think, a couple of things I take away. One is that this has not been a unilateral measure, that even a wider set of countries are involved in the export controls than are in the financial sanctions. So countries like Singapore, South Korea, as well as the other sort of G10 countries that are involved in the financial sanctions, sort of the Five Eyes. The challenge, and this has also been an expansion of export controls from what had been either more narrowly military technology or a narrower set of dual-use technologies. And I think it couples with U.S. administration push to have companies better understand, document, and be transparent about their supply chains, which, of course, if you're a business, you might be doing that yourself because you're recovering from a pandemic and wave of shocks that meant there were discontinuities in your supply chain you didn't expect. But also, of course, they also complain about any time they have to provide information to the government. So I think it's been more effective. You highlighted that we're in one phase of the war. I think from the economic context, I see three phases that we've gone through over the last year. One was a phase of a bit of shock and awe economic measures where the Russians had to do fairly extensive economic defensive measures, textbook ones, for countries in financial crisis. And the imports collapsed. And that was a function of export controls. It was a function of Russia's own capital controls. And it was also a function of nobody knew how Russia would be able to pay. Then there was a phase, and in that whole time period, Russia was still exporting fuel. So they were earning a lot, but they couldn't spend anywhere near as much of it. Then you get to a midpoint where they, they're still earning a lot. Some countries like Turkey and China are starting to export a little bit, that's sort of middle of last year. But they're still earning a lot, still struggling, and that's a period where Western countries were stopping their exports, and the emerging markets hadn't yet shifted. And now we're in a third phase where both imports have come back up. I would tend to think, it's hard for us to say, but the quality of those imports are probably lower than they were getting. They're paying more from it. Typically in a quasi-barter situation, you pay a lot to middlemen. They're variety, but it's hard to fully track that. And then also they're getting less economic revenue. Some of that's their own choice, right? They're no longer selling natural gas through pipelines to most of Europe. But some of it is, this partial success of the price caps from a revenue perspective. So I probably didn't answer all the three questions, but I've talked for long enough, so we can come back to it afterwards.
And Marie, obviously you've family in Europe, as do I, and what sort of seemed to happen this year, and it sort of relates to what Rachel's been talking about, was, you know, that it was a fairly mild winter, right? In terms of your, I mean, I had family who was saying I didn't have to turn the heat on. #blessed, you know, and so I'm just trying. And there was all this talk at the time about, you know, a really rough winter is going to lead to a break in this European unity, but we didn't really see it on the grand scale. So I guess sort of this is a bit of an unfair open-ended question, but did Europe get lucky this past winter?
Well, I'm not an energy specialist, but what I would say, well, first I went to Berlin in a few months ago, and it really struck me that everywhere you had, like, in every store, is like, we close our doors to save energy, but please come in. Like, it was everywhere, and it's in every conversation, something that we did, like, the public discovered that energy actually has strategic implications, and it was new. And I think it's really a very, very.
It was new?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. I mean,
For individual lives,
for
right?
individuals, like when I mean, it's hopeful, but to say, but you know, when you talk to a German, it's like, no, it's you have geostrategic implications in that, and yes, this is new for the French public. Before it wasn't, and the European public. But yeah, on the overall, I would say this winter was not going to be the issue. The issue is next winter. And so I will be very careful, like looking forward how we will have this.
All right, I'll leave that for the next panel. But I do want to quickly ask. I mean, you know, we're talking already about another EU, like a 10 sanctions package and all that. I mean, right now it feels like, and tell me if you think you're, but it feels like the EU is just trying to maybe move things along quickly because they are worried about the next winter and just trying to almost rush things through at this point.
Exactly. I mean, you have a lot of initiatives. Yeah, you have like the LNG supply is more like with the United States, and you know, it's like it's not sometimes just about political will, but it's also just about capacities, and you have like Norway definitely is supplying a lot, but also Norway being careful, as you know, for their own strategy. You have everything's going on with Azerbaijan, and like and suddenly. I mean, Europe has to deal with countries that not necessarily like their natural partners, I would say. So like Norway it is, for sure, but like if you have to turn to Qatar, like it's so different. And I think sometimes we have misconceptions across the Atlantic, because for the United States, they don't need, I mean, they're fine. And so it's, for Europe, they need their own energy strategy. And it might not sometimes please all the time the United States, and also because you had in Europe, it was quite impressive to see, especially like in the media and some editorials, like, oh, the United States are profiting like from this war. And which really struck me, because you know it's the result of lack of strategic thinking in that areas, but we have to be very careful also here in the United States, because we don't understand so much how the Europeans are paying the high price. I mean, the Ukrainians by far, but the Europeans, like the sanctions are hitting them way harder. Their energy transition and everything that's going on is hitting them harder. And if the feeling is that, because I heard it, like, yeah, I mean, it's the United States, they're profiting from it, and it's their fault. And, you know, you have to come back to, okay, let's break things down. This is Russia's war, it's not Americans. But sometimes it can be easy if you're struggling to pay your bills, you will look for simple answers. And I think we have a specific responsibility here in the United States to hear that, because these countries in Europe, they're facing election, they have populist movements, they've got far right, far left movements, etc. And this is also what's going on right here on these issues.
I would just venture to say that if people are praising America's strategic thinking, that's probably more of an indictment on Europe than anything else. But you want to come to you. I mean, you know, of course, this war, the backdrop to this war is, you know, what's going on with Ukraine. People in Eastern Europe, et cetera. But everyone from basically Central Europe westward wants to talk to me about China when it comes to this war, right? And what they want, eastward too, yeah, whatever, north, southward. But their usual things are this, right? One, you know, if we don't stand up for Ukraine, we being the West, they might make a move on Taiwan. Two, you know, you have to be able to isolate countries that are willing to try to take areas by force or be so autocratic, et cetera. Otherwise, China may get even worse. I'm very much paraphrasing a whole bunch of arguments. But has there been any validity to that? As you've been studying China this past year, have they really been learning those kinds of lessons, or have they been getting others that we haven't really thought about?
I think they have. I think for the Chinese military, when they look at the war in Ukraine, they also started with the assumption that Russia was going to prevail within a week. I think a lot of people did, and they certainly were no exception. And for them, it was a pretty simple answer then. But at that time, they were also assuming that Russia was just going to take a part of Ukraine instead of a full-scale invasion. But for the PLA, I think the most direct takeaway is that the war may not go the way that you thought it would. And they have been planning this attack on Taiwan because they have to, right? If you're a military strategist, you have to be prepared, and you have to prepare for the worst.
The Defense Department has a plan to stop zombie attacks, so I guess.
Yep, that's what militaries do. So for them, I would say that the war in Ukraine really sends a precautionary warning to them that you may think that you are going to have an easy, quick, swift, decisive victory, but you may not. And you have to consider what is going to happen to your political legitimacy, to the leadership, and to your international image overall. And I think that message is very useful in terms of sending that warning to the Chinese, the warmongers who are saying, oh, let's just invade Taiwan, let's just take it over and call it a day. It really sends a very strong message. But having said that, it also depends on how things go, right? If Taiwan declares independence tomorrow morning, I don't think the Chinese military will even think twice that, oh, well, we have to go, then we have to go. But without that kind of development, I think the chance of China taking the initiative to launch an attack against Taiwan has become smaller as a result of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, so to put it in DC terms, right? In terms, if the report card, the deterrence report card of the last year is deterrence up in terms of China at this point.
Yeah, deterrence up, but then you have to look at the detailed comparison between Ukraine and Taiwan, right? Well, Ukraine has land border with this many countries, and you can actually send military assistance through the border into Ukraine, but Taiwan is an island. So it entails a completely different set of strategies coming to helping Taiwan defending itself. But then again, if we look at the will in China to start this war or to take the initiative to start this war, I think the deterrence effect has been increased significantly.
Well, yeah, to your point, as a former president would say, there's a thing called water, and that matters, right? He said it about Puerto Rico. Look it up. Mike, it feels like this past year we went from almost tactical aims were really high, and now they are now in the sort of jagged front line in the east. So one, is that where you've been noticing, right, just a real consolidation of that's where that effort is in the east? But two, has there been anything to indicate in your mind of the last year that the strategic aim has changed, that the goal really is to eventually overtake the Ukraine still?
I mean, when looking at Moscow. So my sense is that Russia's minimal war aims right now are to take the Donbass, right? And what they intend to do after that, I don't know. It depends on how it goes. I don't think they're close to accomplishing that at all, but that's clearly the goal of their current offensive operation, and that's been their objective after withdrawing from Kherson. Second, I do think that in terms of strategic aims, the broader aims of the war, Moscow has not at all abandoned its objectives of trying to impose its will on Ukraine. Just a question of how. The initial operation was de facto a decapitation strike. It was aimed at regime change and occupying large parts of the country, right? Had no hex strategy, sort of no plan B, and it failed spectacularly for all sorts of reasons, and we don't have time to get into them, right? After that, though, the Russian military did begin to pursue an approach that focused on the Donbass and an attempt to attrition the Ukrainian military. And to be very frank, if it wasn't for the United States, if it wasn't for Western countries, and I think Ukrainians fully acknowledge this, over the course of the summer, this war might have well gone a trajectory of the Winter War, 39-1940, right? Ukraine was off in a bad way in terms of artillery ammunition, equipment, and both armies have lost a lot of their best people. Neither of these forces look a year down the line into this war the way they began it. They are variegated armies, they have mobilized personnel, they have a mix of older equipment, or on the Ukrainian side, a mix of Western equipment. To me, the question is, does Russia still intend to impose regime change in Ukraine? I don't think so. What I think the Russian goal today, from my point of view, is if they can't control Ukraine, right, if they couldn't occupy it, and they failed at the beginning, is to essentially break it and to make it not viable as a state, right? So that's to take the part that they prefer, and if they could, maybe sign some sort of ceasefire, rearm, and then pursue a secondary campaign across Ukraine's southern coast, take Odessa, and then make Ukraine no longer viable as an economic state. I think that remains to be their objective. If the first goal was essentially to occupy it and to return Ukraine to Russia and maybe sign a joint union state treaty with Belarus, then the secondary goal is to pursue this via a different way, which is to try to make Ukraine not viable as a state. At least that's my sense of it, right? Obviously, I don't live in Putin's head and I don't live in Moscow, so I'm not going to pretend to know it, but that's my best sense of it.
No one should live in Putin's head, especially if you don't like horror movies. But
But a lot of people do. How many articles have you read titled "What Putin Really Wants"?
oh, for sure, yeah. No,
True.
that's, I can't. I'm sure they looked at the intel about that. But really quick, since you going back to something you said a bit ago, right? That wars are really at the end of the day about attrition. I mean, what we saw with Surovikin when he was in charge was effectively just launch a bunch of missiles, hurt a bunch of people, destroy a bunch of infrastructure. Was that? I mean, did that prove really any sort of turning point? Did that prove effective in some way, or just simply destructive?
No, so actually early on in the war, Russian use of long-range precision-guided weapons was quite irrational. It's one of those fascinating things you learn as a military analyst, where countries have the hardware, they buy the capabilities, they have the ISR, they have the technology, but they don't have the software. They don't have any experience in doing it, and it's very hard to kind of tell that just by looking at their exercises or limited force employment. And what you don't realize is that they're actually very inexperienced in using this kind of technology at scale. And they think that watching the United States, the US makes it look easy, okay? But actually, if you just watch the Europeans try to do it without the United States, you realize how hard it is right off the bat, right? And so they fell very flat in trying to use a lot of this technology they had acquired. But later on, in the fall, you saw that actually a rather different team came in with a critical infrastructure targeting scheme that I think was likely one of their better planned out campaigns in the war. The reason why I think we were quite fortunate is that they'd already spent a large percentage of their long-range precision-guided weapons on their arsenal, and were overly dependent on Iranian drones as well, and that strike campaign, while effective to an extent, they simply couldn't sustain the waves of strikes. The United States and Western countries got after supporting Ukraine in terms of air defense and air defense ammunition. It could have potentially posed a dilemma, right? Do Ukrainians defend their cities, or do they defend the front line? Because that campaign was attritioning Ukraine's air defense ammunition. It's very straightforward. And if the Russian military could have sustained it over time, it might have led to some pretty big challenges. But two things happened. First, they're clearly too low on long-range precision-guided weapons, and it looks like they're about firing per month what they make per month, or close to it. So they're at best able to sustain a strike wave based on their rate of production, which is fairly low. And second, and we already spoke to the subject, it was a warm winter. And it didn't just help Europeans, who discovered that energy matters. It also helped Ukraine quite a bit. This winter was unusually warm. And it made the Russian strike campaign, which was targeting energy infrastructure and water management infrastructure, much less effective. At least that's my sense of it, right? It'll be much better, it'll be much easier to tell this history and to understand what happened and why a bit further down the line. I'm just being frank about it.
Since we're winding down here, I'm going to ask more unfair, open-ended questions. It's kind of concluding, but one specific thing with Michael here, because he had mentioned, Russia's right now basically using the weaponry that they make, right? It's been almost zeroing it out. Some people would probably look at that comment and say, well, then we haven't done a good, we, the West, haven't done a good job of restricting Russia of its weaponry. Or I mean, how would you respond to I'm sure there's going to be some critics who would make that point.
Yeah, and I think, and the dynamics and the same things are going to come out, this is not a panel about balloons and other things like that, but about Western-made components in a whole variety of issues. So I think some of the challenge, and this is where, so some of the question mark is yes, we probably haven't done as good a job as we could. I also think, we sort of start to look and try to understand what different supply chains are opening up, obviously with Iran, with China. I mean, I agree. I think China's been playing this interesting role of larger companies and state banks and the like have tended to shun the sort of more illicit sides of the trade, or engaging maybe in the gray, sort of the gray market of things that are sort of not necessarily that stay away from the things that are actually illegal for them, direct sanctions violations. But if the U.S. leaves a loophole, they'll take that. So I think that's where, and we go back to the previous question of how important export control is. That's why it's key. Now, those become even harder to enforce as the enforcement location is increasingly moved more underground and be in countries that either might be strategic partners but don't see eye to eye with the U.S. and Europe on a lot of things. And so that second group, I'm thinking about places like, in the Gulf, places like the UAE, places like Turkey, which of course also is dealing with the results of this very devastating earthquake, and is sort of, and the like. But I'm also thinking about sort of China in that way. And so I was heartened to see the Department of Commerce is adding a few more export control officers in different locations, including Taiwan, but they have like less than a dozen around the world, sort of monitoring and looking for these violations. So I do think it comes back to we need to think about stepping up enforcement. We need to think about helping businesses comply. And it's not only sort of what the U.S. needs to do, because I think a lot of times, you speak to folks at OFAC and at Commerce, and they say, well, we really don't have the resources to do all the things that we need to do, but go to U.S. allies, and of course, proportionally, they have a lot less. So I think it's a balancing act, and it comes back to this whole sanctions they build over time, but people find workarounds, and so we need to think about those lines. And we also need to be honest about what are components that are just out there and are not as unique as we think they are. And the broader point that we haven't brought up, but I'd be remiss in not, is that I think one of the big takeaways from the last year has been a comfort level with not only these coercive tools, but with the sort of more positive industrial policy tools, governments being involved in key markets, key supply chains. Marie talked about, we all talked about the role of the governments in European and other energy markets. And so thinking about not only how does that help get to goals, being realistic about what those goals are, and being realistic about where they might interact and complicate our other goals.
Now, maybe this is quickly for both of you, but be remiss if we didn't talk about Iran for a quick second. I mean,
that's why I had to at least.
Right. This is where I want to go. I mean, at this point, one of the, if you're looking at sort of, and it depends on who you talk to, but one of the failures of the year has been that the U.S. and Europe had sort of allowed Iran to get so deeply involved in this war, sending drones and all other kinds of materials. In Europe, it's sort of in a weird spot here because it wants to be back in the nuclear deal. There are countries that have relationships with Iran, and yet it is still doing what it's doing. So, in the past year or so, have you seen any moments where maybe Europe didn't tighten the screws on Iran where it should have?
Well, first maybe on Iran, and I would say Russia doesn't. If we on more positive note, Russia doesn't have many friends.
Yeah.
And this is something we may forget. Like even with China has been very cautious. Mm-hmm. I would say something like China, for instance, did a lot about enhancing the Russian narrative in a lot of the countries which are not in Europe, and this is not in the States, and so this is not something we see. But if you look at other countries, it's been fairly successful. Yet. A lot of the countries overwhelmingly condemn Russian invasion or just don't support it, also in fear of sanctions, kind of sanctions. So that's the first thing. And so, they have to turn to Iran because you don't have a lot of choices. Mm-hmm. And I'll say in Europe right now, we don't talk at all about reviving the revival of the JCPOA, like the nuclear deal. It's not about that. On the contrary, it's really coming to a point that we have to engage more, like the Europeans, with the other countries of the region. And could they do more? I'm not an Iranian expert, so I don't want to talk too much about it. But it's definitely one of the big evolution. But I will be maybe more optimistic in the way that Russia doesn't have any friends. North Korea and Iran. It's not much. Look at friends of Ukraine.
Yun, it's a home game for you here at the Stimson Center, so I'm going to give you the last word. And I'm sorry to do this to you, but balloons.
And other UFOs.
Well, I want to link this to the sort of next panel. I guess I'm wondering is, now that there's all this hullabaloo about what's been going on, I'm wondering if there's even going to be a slight motive in Beijing to be like, maybe we shouldn't be so forward-leaning on, working with Russia here because we kind of need, the spotlight off of us. Or is there going to be absolutely no linkage whatsoever?
first, just to wrap up the Iran angle, I just want to say that what the Iranian president is visiting China is at Chinese president's invitation. But if you look at China's choice, it's clearly leaning towards GCC. Look at Xi Jinping's trip to Saudi. China and Iran signed that 25-year blueprint for bilateral relations, but nothing has really transpired. I think China's choice there is actually fairly clear. But I do see that China is not abandoning either Iran or North Korea or Russia. So there's still a little bit of ambiguity, well, quite a bit of ambiguity going on there. So in terms of the balloons, well, it has been covered by media so much, right? We know that the first one, we know the first one is definitely Chinese, and the one that flew through, I think, over Colombia or Central America, that one is definitely Chinese. But the other three, I watched the press briefings by DOD, and they just refuse to tell you where it is from. And they have collected debris, and it has to make you wonder that what does that mean? What is the message that is being crafted here? That if they have the debris, they should be able to tell what they are and where they're from, but they're not sharing any of that information. So I honestly don't know how to read that message. Maybe you can tell us. But from the Chinese strategic calculus, from that point of view, the Chinese want to move on from this yesterday, right? They want.
So do I.
Good for you. They still want Secretary Blinken to visit Beijing because that visit has been rescheduled. The State Department didn't say it is canceled. But then, of course, it depends on the timing. March is domestic politics in China. April, McCarthy could go to Taiwan. So there's all those political events that will be affecting each other. But I think if the Chinese are given a choice, they want to move on from this. They want to see some improvement of U.S.-China relations. The spirit of Bali summit for them still stands because they're hoping that Yellen maybe will visit if Blinken does not. And Secretary of Commerce could also visit, so there's a whole plan over there.
Yeah.
All right, well, we could do this panel for forever, but there's a second one coming. Thanks for sticking with us, staying in your seats, keep watching online, and the future-looking panel's on its way. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Al.
From panel one, and to thank all our great panelists. I'd like to invite the in-person audience. If you'd like to step outside and grab yourself a cup of coffee, take a quick break, we will be back here in 5 minutes in order to start panel two. While we wait, I did just want to say that next week, the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program, we will be publishing a paper testing assumptions about the last year of the war in Ukraine. For those who are not familiar with our program, one of the things we sometimes do is subject Washington or our own common wisdoms to scrutiny to try and see if they hold up. So next week we will be publishing a selection of 5 or 6 assumptions about the last year of the war in Ukraine. Everything from the idea that Europe is incapable of its own defense, which we found to be false, to the idea that we can learn lessons for Taiwan from the war in Ukraine, which is probably true, but as the last panel told us, China may be learning somewhat different lessons than we are learning here in Washington. So the next panel will be up momentarily. You'll have to excuse us. We're having to do a mic check, by which I mean there are at least 2 guys out there called Mike that need to get microphones put on them before we can start. But I just wanted to call out a few really interesting points from that last panel. And I think, something that really stuck out to me is last year, our program at our prior home held an event moderated by Alex Ward, and also Mike Kaufman was on the panel. And this happened, I think, about 10 days out from the invasion of Ukraine. And I think it was really notable to me as somebody who sort of helped to moderate both events, just how different the vibe or the sense that you got. As people commented in this panel 1 year ago, I think the widespread assumption was that Russia would just roll across Ukraine and we would be in a situation where we'd be having to deal with a, revanchist Russia that's just seized a bunch of territory, toppled a government, etc. And that is not even remotely where we are. And in many ways, ways that is a very good thing, but it certainly does make some of the dilemmas that Washington has faced, the European capitals have faced in the last year, somewhat more acute than they would have been if this was a relatively short war. So, you know, for me, I think some of the big takeaways that I took from that first panel was first, you know, Washington's tendency, or you could say slight pathology, towards looking for silver bullets, or as Mike Kaufman put it there, looking for game changers in both the military space and in the sanctions space. And I think, you know, one thing that we have seen again in the last year is that many of the steps that were taken, you know, they were important, they were helpful in terms of policy outcomes, they were not necessarily game changers. And so there is a certain level, I think, of humility about policy tools that we can take from the last year that is very helpful more generally in US foreign policy. The second, and I thought Marie's comment on this was extremely interesting, but the notion that Europeans have done more in the last year than they could have imagined prior to the start of this war. And that's something that, you know, I've spent a lot of time in Europe and various countries over the last year or two, and this is something that sort of stands out to me. From a Washington point of view, you can say, well, you know, European allies are still not spending on their defense adequately, they're still not providing ground troops, et cetera, et cetera. But when you talk to folks in European capitals, they'll make the point that, you know, they have imposed massive economic sanctions, they're sending lethal weapons in ways that they wouldn't have a year before. You know, and to put sort of a point on Marie's comment on that, it is really fascinating to think about what you would have said if somebody had told you in January 2022 that the Germans would be sending tanks to Ukraine, right, just 1 year out. That is sort of the shift in dialogue that has happened in Washington. A third point, because at this point I really am just vamping, until the other panel can get back in here. But, you know, a third point, I guess, that I really took from this discussion is perhaps the less than happy question. That's an open question of which side in this conflict really has time on their side. Because I think we've had this debate a number of times over the last year or so. You know, now it's the case that the Russians don't want to negotiate because they want the war to continue because they think time is on their side. Now it's the case that people are saying, well, Ukraine should really think about negotiating because time is not on their side. This seems to go back and forward. And I think, you know, across the fields that our panelists talked about, energy, economics, military equipment, that calculus is still extremely unclear. And so, you know, that I think is going to be one of the big questions going forward. And I know one of the things that our second panel is going to do is try and make more of an attempt to look a little bit forward, talk a little bit more about where we are rather than a retrospective on the last year. I think most of our panelists are here. Hopefully we'll have a full house pretty soon. One last point, I think, came out of the last panel that was extremely interesting, was divergent European and American views on a lot of things. And we've seen this, obviously, in many other situations, but I do think it is increasingly interesting to see, you know, Europe views the last year in many ways as it has stepped up to the plate, it has done so much.
Mike.
The dialogue in Washington is that Europe still hasn't done enough in some ways. And so there are some really interesting divergences in viewpoint here, and that is something I think that policymakers are really going to have to confront going forward. And thank goodness our last panelist is heading through the door because I have run out of comments. So please join me in giving a big welcome to our second panel. Our wonderful moderator is Amy McKinnon from Foreign Policy, who is an amazing journalist and also my fellow Scot in DC. So please join me in welcoming them. Thank you.
All good? Yeah, okay.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Emma. Your accent is going to send my accent haywire, as it tends to drift in the presence of other Scots. Welcome to the second panel of today, an emerging multipolar era, global perspectives on the war in Ukraine. I'm delighted to be joined by our distinguished panelists. Immediately to my left here, we have Mike Mazar, a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. We're also joined by Michael Kimmage, professor of history at Catholic University of America. Then we have Akriti Vasudeva Kalyankar, who is a fellow at the South Asia program here at the Stimson Center. And then we have Ebenezer Obadar, the Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow for Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome. My name is Amy McKinnon. I am a national security reporter with Foreign Policy magazine. We have a daunting task ahead of us. We have to cover a whole world in only an hour, so I'm going to spare you the throat clearing, and I'll get into my questions. Michael, as I warned you, I'm going to start with you and put you on the spot. The war has really helped to kind of galvanize Europe and NATO allies in terms of support for Ukraine, and in the West, we really talk about a paradigm shift, a norm-shattering moment, and a turning point, which it really is and has been for us. But the response in the wider world kind of has raised the question of, well, is it for the rest of the world, or is it just from where we're sitting? I'm wondering if you can kind of start by giving us the 10,000 kind of foot view of the global fault lines that the war has exposed.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to Stimson for the invitation.
Oh, and sorry, a reminder to our panelists to put on your mics.
Oh, is it not on? I think it is on.
Is it?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, my apologies.
Does it work, audience? Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. I think that the question can be approached. It's a very large question. It can be approached through perhaps two contradictory points, and some of it came up in the previous panel. I think that the war has shown itself to be obviously much less successful than Russia intended it to be, and that reveals serious problems with Russia's military infrastructure, with its military modernization going back for years. And Russia has demonstrated probably exactly what it didn't wish to demonstrate with this war, which is that the inefficiencies and, to a degree, the corruption of the Russian political system have been crippling. And I think on top of that, with this initial point, there's just the caliber of decision-making in Russia, the ways in which Putin didn't share information, the ways in which he came up with a war plan that, as Michael Kaufman said in the previous panel, was to decapitate Ukraine. And I suppose there was some chance of that panning out at the beginning, but I was thinking on closer inspection, it's sort of a lunatic war plan. So whether one looks with indifference on Russia, on the war, sort of where different countries are politically, I don't think that it's possible to ignore the kind of war that Russia has fought, and Russia has, I think, in a very objective sense, diminished itself, at the very least as a military force. And sort of the first point that I would make. I'm sure that matters greatly for China, as Yoon Soon said at the end of this morning's earlier panel, and you could tick through the world's countries and sort of see how that is a significant circumstance. But secondly, in somewhat in contradiction to the first point, it feels to me like Russia has, for the time being, a sustainable global strategy. And this is to absorb the effect of sanctions, which Russia has been quite successful at. I think the failure of Western or sort of Ukraine coalition sanctions to date is one of the big stories of the war as well, at least given what was promised at the beginning of the war, that Russia could be isolated, that its calculus could be changed, and that hasn't occurred. In many ways, Russia has maneuvered, not elegantly, but sort of maneuvered adequately in the wake of the sanctions regime, and that shows some of its strategic depth in terms of connections to the wider world. And I think where it's maybe more surprising for those of us in Washington looking at the war from an American point of view, where Russia has not been unsuccessful, is in making the political case for the war. And this is not, as far as I know, that Russia has convinced the world's population that this is a just war, or that Russia is not committing war crimes, or that this war is even a good idea, but that there is a kind of equivalence in many ways between the West and Russia. I think that's an argument that Russia has made repeatedly, and that does resonate a lot with global populations. So yes, Russia is not innocent. It's an aggressor in this case, but the countries that are supporting Ukraine I think are often also viewed as aggressors, and in some ways Russia has been able to neutralize some of the negative press that the war has naturally generated through a kind of outreach that to me really goes back to the Soviet Union and to a very diversified international scene where, Russia has a presence and it's listened to, and, it sort of functions diplomatically. And that's one of the things, I'll use the word again, just to conclude my points, the word sustainable. It's one of the things that has been sustainable for Russia as a foreign policy, but it's also one of the things that makes the war itself sustainable for Russia, whether through getting around the sanctions regime or getting weapons, getting microchips, et cetera. It matters for the prosecution of the war that Russia is as globally networked as it is.
I mean, you mentioned at the beginning there that the invasion has really revealed the Russian military to be a bit of a paper tiger. And one country that Russia has very deep defense ties with is, of course, India. Akriti, in a piece that you wrote shortly after the war began, you noted that something like 85% of India's military equipment is either Russian or Soviet descent. And you argued that this should be a moment for New Delhi to kind of reconsider its defense ties with Moscow. Since you wrote that piece almost a year ago, have you seen any signs that that is the case, that they're rethinking at least that military dependence, if not their economic ties?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So I do think that's the case. I mean, I do want to say in the beginning that it has been a really difficult situation for New Delhi. It's a tightrope to navigate because here is a long-standing defense partner that has supported India at the UN many times on votes on Kashmir, etc. As you said, it's heavily dependent on equipment of Russian or Soviet origin. But on the other hand, the war has really brought home to New Delhi that Russia is actually in decline, and that India's dependence on Russia is actually something that it needs to change. Now, the movement in India with respect to indigenization or self-reliance for defense equipment has existed for many years, but it is particularly accelerated after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as the pandemic, and also the ongoing border standoff between India and China. All of these things have really brought home to New Delhi that it needs to focus on developing a lot of this, spare parts, ammunition, equipment at home. And the main thing that I think defense planners in India have realized, and the Indian Army chief actually very recently said that there was a challenge to sustenance of weapon systems because of Russia's delay in delivery because of the war. So that has really changed the way that India has actually started thinking about where it sources its weapons from. But also the fact is that India's future threat is China. And Russian weapon systems are not modern enough. They don't actually give India an opportunity to compete with China. And so Russia is not really the partner that India is looking for. That's why India is moving to partners like France, like the United States, like Israel, thinking about how you can actually do co-production and development of weapon systems with those countries, because that's where the modernization lies. Those are the partners that are going to help India compete with China in the future.
I mean, India is often, when people are talking about kind of global responses to the war beyond North America and Europe, India is often the country that people refer to. It's significantly ramped up its oil purchases from Russia. Do you see, I mean, based on what you're saying there about the kind of growing awareness of a need to move away from Russia as a defense partner, do you see the kind of New Delhi's response to the war over this past year as kind of, is this more kind of momentary opportunism, seizing the moment to get some cut price oil? But in the longer run, do you think we have maybe perhaps overstated India's position on the war and on Russia?
I think the way that Delhi would explain that position is that India imports about 85% of its energy supplies from abroad. And so any changes or any fluctuations in prices are really going to impact India, which is a developing country and has a large population that it's trying to bring out of poverty, it's trying to provide food and employment for. And so a lot of the buying of the oil that is cheaper, discounted crude oil, is actually driven by that, by domestic considerations. But I would say that I have seen a few things over the past year which to me indicate that India is actually shifting its stance away from dependence on Russia, but also on the political relationship. Now, one thing that's really important to note here is that New Delhi actually, as its diplomatic approach, never criticizes a partner country. They never say anything publicly about a country that they even might have disagreements with. And so the fact that Prime Minister Modi actually said to Putin directly, on his face that today is not the era of war is really significant actually in Indian foreign policy. It's not something that's been done before. And I think that, the stance is actually that privately, there was actually a lot of debate going on within Indian strategic circles, but how do you deal with the situation? Because like I said, on the one hand, you have a long-standing defense partner, but on the other hand, India does believe in the principle of territorial sovereignty, and the rights of countries like Ukraine, because India kind of has that situation with China, with other countries in the region. And so, and the other thing that I think India's had to grapple with is, what does the Russia-China relationship mean? The growing alliance between Russia and China, what does that mean for India's defense needs, but also its situation on the border? The fact that India and China are in the third year in a row face-to-face along the line of actual control, which is a de facto border between the two countries. And if Russia becomes more isolated after this war and becomes more beholden to China, what does that mean for the India-China border? Does China then incentivize Russia or tell Russia to not provide supplies to India, to do something that would actually make India's situation on the border really difficult? And so we're seeing, I think slowly but surely we're seeing moves from India, whether it's on indigenization, whether it's some of the rhetoric, whether it's even some of the conversations at the UN or some of the votes, which, for example, India's criticism of the killing of civilians in Bucha, or calling for an independent investigation, those are actually things that it hasn't done before. So I would say over this past year, there's greater realization of some of the challenges that the war brings for India.
Ebenezer, I want to bring you in now to the conversation. At the first UN vote at the beginning of March last year, shortly after the war began, 141 countries voted to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and this was really held up as a moment of global unity. But when you kind of parse who voted which way and where they were in the world, there were some interesting trends that began to emerge. And as you noted in a piece for Council on Foreign Relations, that 17 of the countries that opted to abstain were in Africa, and I think that's around half of the total number of abstentions. Can you just kind of give us an overview on why the reticence among African countries to condemn Russia's actions?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So if you look at what you might call the African reaction, you're actually thinking about three kinds of reactions. So you have Eritrea, on the one hand. Eritrea is absolutely, totally, irreversibly committed to Russia. So Eritrea stands alone. And then you have a country like South Africa that is, more or less hedging its bets. Does it want to go right? Does it want to go left? Does it want to play one side against the other? And then you have countries like Nigeria that are committed to the Western cause, that fully support Ukraine, but are rather lukewarm about it. So there is no single African reaction, and which raises the question, why? I think maybe a couple of things to understand. One is the way in which every global conflict sort of reveals deep fractures in relationships. This one certainly did. Many African countries had been nursing grievances, legitimate or not, against the United States. And this provided a very important, a timely occasion for them to be able to express those grievances. The other thing, which is sort of a corollary of that, is that if this war had taken place, had started maybe 10 years ago, I bet you the African reaction would have been different. But this took place in a moment of very interesting intellectual ferment in Africa around what is called decolonization. The whole idea about finding African ideas that are authentic to Africa and basically downplaying perceived African reliance on the West and Western ideas. We can go into the, into the weeds on what those things mean. But the moment itself was very, very interesting. It was a very interesting moment. And it was a moment in which, because of that ferment and because of those pre-existing grievances against the West, there was this division over how to respond to the Ukraine conflict.
So I have two questions follow on from that. Firstly, just quickly, 10 years ago, if the war had started, how do you think African countries would have voted?
I think many African countries would have probably voted for the United States.
To condemn the war.
To condemn the war. So what has happened over the last 10 years? What has happened over the last 10 years is Russia has deepened its hold, enlarged its sphere of influence in Africa. China has become a more major player than it's always been in Africa. And the intellectual ferment that I refer to wasn't there 10 years ago. So it's been like a perfect storm. If you're thinking historically over the last 10 years, what happened, what could have happened 10 years ago, it's significantly different what we've had over the last 1 year.
And that was something you noted in another piece, that on the one hand, issues of sovereignty and territorial integrity will really resonate for a lot of African countries, but at the same time, they detect more than a whiff of Western hypocrisy when being asked to kind of line up and condemn these things. Do you think that the US and its partners in Europe have been sufficiently mindful of this in their engagements with Africa on the issue of the war?
So I wrote 3 pieces for the Council on Foreign Relations on this. So, and I need to explain this in order for people to make sense of that question. So first, I alerted the policymaking community to the fact that the reaction you are seeing is totally warranted. What you should try to understand is where it's coming from. And then when I felt that nobody was listening to that, I wrote another piece saying, a wedge is opening up. Be careful. Be very mindful of that so that you don't dip in the wedge. And then the final one, which most people don't like to talk about, but which I always try to emphasize is, I also wrote to African countries, I said, do not cut your nose to spite your face, right? So because that's important. So let's talk about those grievances. Those grievances tend to center on the fact that, and there's a lot of evidence to support it, that the West has always said one thing and done another. We've always preached the language. We've always messaged around human rights, individual liberties, and all those things, but we've never really. So when we say dictator, we've always embraced dictator and said, but it's our dictator, right? And so there's plenty of support for that. And when this war broke out, many African countries came out and said, hey, why is this about territorial sovereignty? Why is this about political independence of Ukraine? Why is this important right now when in the past you've never put your money ideologically where your mouth was? That's fine. But remember, the leaders saying that aren't themselves Democrats. These are authoritarians, the Musevenis of this world, the Yademas of this world, the Kagames of this world. So I found myself in a situation where I had to be telling Western countries, especially the United States, be mindful. You've not always been pure. But at the same time, telling African leaders that, hey, you are not actually being honest. So I think it's these two things that you need to balance. The sense that the West has always been hypocritical, but that the hypocrisy is not limited to the West, and that there have been African leaders who are also hypocritical themselves.
I would strongly encourage you all to read Ebenezer's 3 pieces for the Council on Foreign Relations that he mentioned. They are goes into wonderful detail about these complexities. Mike, I want to bring you in now. We've continuing our world tour. I want to look to East Asia and particularly to Taiwan. There's been a lot of discussion about lessons from Ukraine for Taiwan, and in many ways, I think a lot of people who've worked in defense planning see these as very overblown, perhaps, or a stretch at best. But do you think that the war has shaped Asian states' perceptions of their own security needs for the future, and also their perceptions of the U.S. as a defense guarantor?
A bit. I mean, I think that primarily the reactions in East Asia are a continuing reaction to changes in military balances and thinking in East Asia. I mean, one quick thing I would want to say, sort of following on Ebenezer, is I think this is an incredibly important insight, and to me, in East Asia and more broadly, and not just East Asia, but Indo-Pacific more generally, where U.S. strategy is focused, the war sort of heightened 2 contradictory realities. One is it intensifies the perception of great power rivalry. So yes, in that sense, for example, some of Japan's recent actions are partly fueled by a sense of, Russia's actions are indicating where these revisionist powers are headed. And it also sort of reaffirms the importance of American leadership, so wanting to get close to the United States, Australia, Japan, the new South Korean regime. But on the other hand, the war also, I think, strongly indicates the fact that this is not resolving into a binary confrontation. And there's a lot of countries in the world that are going to want to maintain their own independent space. And in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere, I think the United States is maybe still trying to cling on to the idea of binary U.S. leadership, what does that mean? For the countries in the region, I think, it's important to remember that only a couple of them are really participating strongly in the sanctions regime. The South Korea is still primarily focused on North Korea as a threat. Japan, there's an issue with a potential Russian threat, but it's really sort of marginal compared to the Chinese threat. So to me, in that region, the big long-term question is what lessons is China drawing from this in terms of its own ambitions, in terms of whether, and in that regard, I mean, we can talk about it, but I think there's a lot of, the essential answer is we don't know and it can change, but there's a lot of reasons to believe that the Western reaction to Ukraine has not set a precedent that will have any lasting deterrent effect on China.
Okay, I have to ask you to expand on that.
Okay. I mean, I think primarily because if you look at the history of sort of deterrence failures and the thinking of aggressors, the problem that we got into with Putin was motivated reasoning, wishful thinking. So the analog in the case of China, if I'm a Chinese senior official, I am telling Xi Jinping, these cases are entirely different. Russia made all these initial operational mistakes. We won't make them. Our plan is more sound. The Russian military was degraded by years of corruption and mismanagement. Ours is not. Ukraine is on the boundary of other NATO countries. Taiwan is 6,000 miles from the United States. Ukraine was already enmeshed in Western security thinking in a way that Taiwan is not. You had a much more significant regional reaction. The West has been able to resupply Ukraine. They will not be able to resupply Taiwan. On down the list, there's a whole bunch of reasons why I think they would easily, the question of the future of deterrence in regard to Taiwan is whether China gets to a point where it believes it must take action. And at that point, if it believes that, it will find ways to convince itself that whatever precedent was set on Ukraine does not apply to it in regard to Taiwan, I think. So the biggest lesson to me of issues of deterrence and credibility is that they are largely contingent. They are largely unique to the case. And just as, for example, in 2015, when Julia Ioffe went to Moscow and said, hey, Russia, when you went into Ukraine in 2014, were you motivated by the failure of America's red line in Syria in 2013, which a lot of people believed at the time? And the Russian answer was, we're Russia. We don't really pay attention to how you treat Syria in regard to how you're going to treat us. I think China's attitude would be exactly the same. We are not Russia, and therefore the lessons that we draw are limited.
Interesting. Michael, I want to come back to you. In the early days, the Biden administration framed the war in Ukraine as a contest between democracy and autocracy, which has been a kind of wider narrative of the Biden administration's foreign policy. But they notably seem to have stepped back from that after a few months. Do you think that that framing was a mistake when looking to rally the entire world around Ukraine's cause, given that there is no shortage of autocratic states in the world?
I think the answer to your question is an unambiguous yes. I don't know about mistake. I mean, it just was a misfire. I don't think that there was a huge cost in trying to make that argument, but it clearly didn't resonate. And perhaps for that reason, there's been a kind of backtracking. I mean, you could look at this a little bit more broadly. It doesn't seem like the Democracy Summit really had a great deal of traction. Perhaps it will be repeated. It felt like the discussion around it was sort of who's going to get invited, who's not going to get invited, as opposed to what work could something like that really do for U.S. foreign policy. And I think the panel has already come up with a lot of reasons for why it would be problematic for the U.S. to make that claim and to build its support for Ukraine around that claim, and to try to draw in countries that don't really have interest in supporting Ukraine into that paradigm. But I'll just add one footnote that takes the point in a different direction. I do think that maybe it's an underexploited aspect of the war for the U.S. sort of ideologically. I do think that the 2019 election in Ukraine is pivotal to the development of the 2022 war. If Poroshenko had won that election, I don't think that you would have the kind of leadership that Ukraine has. And if Zelensky didn't have the sort of legitimacy, remember he gets 70% of the vote in Ukraine from across all kinds of different regions, where the argument in the past had always been it's a divided country, it can't make up its mind, sort of too mired in corruption to go places. That's not what the 2019 election demonstrated. And most importantly, that legitimacy that Zelensky had, I mean, he had low approval ratings before the war, and he was kind of floundering as a politician, but he had legitimacy. That, I think, is fundamental to the war, and one of the reasons why Ukrainian citizens are so sort of eager to support the government and to prosecute the war. So that's an argument in a way about democracy. It's about the resilience of Ukraine as a democracy. I don't know if you can make it into some kind of grand statement about democracy in the world, or sort of how India or Brazil or South Africa have to relate to the war. But it's an argument about Ukraine, and it's an important one. And I haven't seen maybe the Biden administration make that argument as much as they could. So if they could localize the argument, they might be able to get more out of it.
By localize it, do you mean the resilience in the defense perspective of democracies over autocracies?
Yes, and I mean, it's almost a cliche, but there's truth in it. I mean, the comparison that people were making on social media between the images of Putin before the war at his long white table in a sort of phase of pandemic or post-pandemic paranoia, these kind of creepy meetings that he had with his staff where they seemed to be, sort of from coming out of the movie set for the death of Stalin and kind of supporting the great leader in his military venture, and actually the very pathetic ways in which Putin has mobilized Russian society. I don't mean military mobilization, but he's had one big rally so far. A lot of the arguments have shifted and changed from the Kremlin about why they're fighting at first the special military operation and later the war. I think he's done a miserable job for that, and I think that will come back to haunt him eventually in Russia itself. And I don't want to engage too much in this kind of Hollywood contrast and say then there's Zelensky in his olive green T-shirt, sort of striding around the streets of Kiev in a kind of Churchillian aura. I think that that's overdone, but still, I mean, there is just a way in which Zelensky has been more democratic in practice, and that's led perhaps to better decision-making in Ukraine than what you see in Russia. So local in that sense, you can kind of localize the story to those two countries, and then I think it really has meaning and significance. But maybe the Biden administration has to escape from its initial framing of its own foreign policy before the war to get to that argument.
I think someone at Netflix is definitely commissioning Ukraine the movie as we speak. That is being optioned. Staying with you for one more beat, I know you served in the State Department's Office of Policy Planning during the Obama administration. What do you make of the administration's efforts to get countries beyond Europe and North America on the same page with regards to the war? And then do you see any parallels or any lessons for the administration's efforts to rally the world to check growing Chinese influence?
I think that the first question, and take it with a grain of salt from somebody who worked in the Obama administration, and many of the staff have gone on to populate the Biden administration, so be skeptical of what I'm going to say, but I think that they've done quite a fine job of diplomacy. I mean, if you get away from the very macro, big picture story, which is sort of our objective in this particular panel, but sort of look at the coalition that has been formed, it's not easy. These things don't sort of run themselves. I often compare the coalition behind Ukraine sort of since February 2022 with the Second World War coalition, which is such, speaking of Netflix series and sort of Hollywood, much mythologized. But look at the relationship between FDR and de Gaulle, or between Eisenhower and Montgomery, and even FDR, Churchill in some respects with a lot of the planning. I mean, it was very fraught and difficult. And in some respects, this has been much more adept and effective. And I don't think that it's run itself. So I think it's been, sort of a feather in the cap of the Biden administration. And if the team is sort of prepared for anything, going into the war, they were prepared for this, and they had the right Rolodexes, and they've used them to good effect. I think it's probably very difficult to map that situation onto a U.S.-China policy, in the sense that support for a country under duress in the way that Ukraine is under duress, with the images of civilian suffering, I don't want to say it's easy, but it has its own sort of internal logic and validity. The kind of economic heft that the U.S. would need to muster to really sort of deal with China on a global level, that's a much more challenging enterprise in many ways, and there are many local interests or regional interests across the world that sort of run against the United States in that project, and so it really has to get its economic act together in a way that's going to be much more demanding and comprehensive even than support for Ukraine during this war.
You guys are both really busting the narrative that there's a lot of parallels to be drawn between Russia, Ukraine, and China, Taiwan, so thank you for that. Ebenezer, I want to come back to you. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has been on a diplomatic charm offensive in Africa over the past couple of months. He was in South Africa, he was in Eswatini, he was in Angola, most recently he was in Sudan and Mali, I'm sure I'm missing some. I don't know how he does it. It's a lot of travel. What does Moscow actually have to offer African nations? This is something I always see debated, and on one hand, kind of they have strong defense ties, and on the other hand, economically, they really don't compare at all compared to the European Union, the US and China. But have there been any substantive announcements from Lavrov's visit? Do you actually see him making any inroads in these trips?
The answer is in the itinerary that you just revealed. Just look at those countries. There's a common thread there. With the exception of South Africa, all of them are dictatorships. I think we tend to miss the point about what Russia wants in Africa. Economically, it has very little to offer. 70% of its trade with Africa is done with Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, and South Africa. The total value of that trade, $14 billion. The total value of EU trade, $295 billion. Total value of Chinese trade, $265 billion. So what it can't offer economically, it's seeking to offer, and this is the answer to your question, ideologically. What Russia wants in Africa is little Putins, right? To have all these countries.
That's quite a thought.
Yeah. So once you hear an African leader say, Western values, Western democracies, they're not for us, they're echoing what Putin wants, which is to create profound skepticism about Western ideas, and to then construct this binary where African ideas basically center on the big man, and Russia becomes the favored one rather than West. And there's enough fuel, to power that because of some of the things that the United States and Western countries have done in the past. So what Russia wants is, and which is interesting because it's also part of what China also wants. China has a school in, I think, in Kenya, thinking of another in a couple of other countries now. Basically, these are training schools for dictators, right? I mean, that's the best way to put it. So what Russia wants is to institute an encrossed, centralized governance, a model of governance, what you might call, the Russian way of life. There's such a thing in Africa. That's the ideological daylight between Russia and the West in Africa. The fact that the West has been wayward in the past plays to Russia's strength in that regard.
So in some senses, the framing of it being autocracies versus democracies is actually not wrong, at least in Africa.
I don't think it's wrong. I actually kind of disagree with Michael. If I started this, if on day one, I would have framed it as such, right? And I would have done so also knowing that I've not always held my side of the bargain. But it's the only way the West wins this war in Africa. So if you look at some of the recent polls about what young people in Africa, what they want, the latest one, I've cited this a couple of times, was done by the BBC. 90% of young people between the ages of 18 and 35. Very scary. Number one, if we had the opportunity, 90% of them said, if we had the opportunity, we would leave Africa tomorrow. We want infrastructure. We want education. But the other thing they talk about? We want popular representation. We want freedom of the press. We want democracy, which is interesting that as interest in democracy is rising in Africa, there's profound skepticism about democracy in the United States, in the West. So it's very interesting that long term, Russia cannot compete with the United States and the EU and the West in Africa economically. Russian GDP is $1.4 trillion. That makes it the equivalent of Brazil or Spain. The only difference is that it has nuclear weapons, right? So economically, it can't compete. It means that the work of the West is cut out for it. Strengthen civil society institutions. Invest in those things that young people say they want. And you have the next 50 years.
I was going to ask you, what would you recommend as policy recommendations? But there you go. You've answered my question.
Look, these things sort of speak for themselves, right? One thing that Russia, just to go back to your original question, one thing that Russia and, of course, China, one thing they do very well is to cultivate African leaders. But I think in the West, people don't realize there's a difference between a regime and the people. So Equatorial Guinea, for instance, where one person has been in power for 500 years, Congo, DRC, Rwanda, and all these other places. I mean, Museveni has been there since 1986. He's going to be there for another 300 years. He's going to hand over to his son, who will hand over. In all these places, there is fundamental disagreement between the people and the regime. What you want to do policy-wise is to ignore the regime in the short term and focus on what the society wants long term. People say that Russia and China have friends in Africa. The West has more friends in Africa because of Western values, right? Not because people don't think that the West sometimes goes back on those values, but because people realize that those values work, which is why 90% of immigration from Africa is to the West. People understand when you say American way of life. They know that when you say the Russian way of life, it's a contradiction in terms.
Akriti, I noticed you nodding along there. I mean, given India's recent backsliding on democracy in recent years, do you see any parallels between what Ebenezer is saying?
I don't think there is really a comparison there. I mean, India is a fully fledged democracy, and of course, there are recent issues that have come up. But I think the question that India is sort of grappling with when it thinks about Russia is actually the Russia-China relationship. Like I said, I think the debate centrally in India is Russia so far gone into the China camp that nothing can be done for India to have an independent relationship to sort of drive a wedge between the two, or is there? And so I think the conversation is about how much space will there be for India to engage with Russia for its interests, to ensure that China and Russia don't get so close together that it's going to put India in a difficult situation with regard to its defense. But for every other practical purpose, I mean, India relates absolutely with the West, whether it's in terms of values, whether it's in terms of the free and open Indo-Pacific, whether it's in terms of looking at the Chinese threat. And so, I mean, I think, one thing I do want to say is that I feel like there's a difference generationally in the way that India thinks about, Russia versus, for example, the US or the West. So during the Cold War, obviously, India and the Soviet Union had strong relations. India tilted towards the Soviet Union. Obviously, there was a treaty of friendship. The Soviet Union also came to India's aid in the 1971 war. So there's that generation of people in the foreign ministry or in the defense ministry who have, fond memories or associations of that relationship with the Soviet Union. But those in government now, those in the foreign ministry or defense ministry, or this generation, knows the American way of life. Like you were saying, we watch American television, come to the US to study. And so there is that, fascination, and there is that kinship with the West. And I see that also reflected in the way that they think about the strategic realities of the region. When India thinks about its key partners, it doesn't think of Russia. It realizes that Russia is in decline. It is a relationship that's pretty transactional over time. Again, like Ebenezer was saying, the India-Russia relationship in terms of the economic relationship is really weak. The only really sustaining aspect of the relationship is defense, and that, again, like I said, because of the issues that Russia's been facing in terms of the war, in terms of providing, spare parts, et cetera, to India, that thinking is changing. And so I expect, the priority relationship that India is going to have is actually going to be with the US. It's going to be with France. It's going to be with Israel. It's going to be with other Quad partners.
So do you see any signs that India's response to the war has dented or impacted its relationship with the US at all, or do you think things are going to continue apace?
I think there there was in the beginning of the war, there was some disappointments and sort of, disagreement between the US and India on Indian positions, because publicly the Indian position was, very subdued and didn't come out really and wasn't critical of Russia. But I think over time, my sense at least is that the US has realized that, considering the Chinese threat, considering the importance of the Indo-Pacific, it is important to keep India on side and to ensure that if India, the US or the West has to build Indian capabilities to fight against China, it actually needs to reduce its dependence on Russia. So I think the two sides have had their disagreements, but they've come to kind of the conclusion that if you have to think about the future, and the future threat is Chinese, and the US and India need to work together.
Mike, I want to bring you back in. I know you've written about kind of Russia's considerations on God forbid, when and if it may resort to using nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons in the conflict. To what extent do you think that the reaction of the world beyond Europe and North America weighs on Moscow's decision making? Would it render Russia completely a pariah were it to kind of to cross that Rubicon?
It's hard to know. I mean, I think even in the case of China, I think it would be perceived as a very big step. I mean, it would really, we talked about in the last panel a little bit about China's muted signaling that this violation of sovereignty, while they're not going to explicitly criticize it, is something that they're not happy with. I think from some conversations, I think use of nuclear weapons would really bring it to another threshold where they'd feel compelled to take some other steps. A lot obviously depends on the context, how they're used, what the target is, what the prelude to that is, and how other people view it. But it's just it would be one of those, much more so I think than the invasion itself. It would really be one of those threshold moments, and it's extremely difficult to predict. In some corners, it might be perceived as if they're already buying into Russia's narratives about the West's responsibility for the origins of this conflict, it might be perceived as something against the West rather than necessarily against Russia. So I think it's very hard to tell, but there's no question that in the coalition that has been facing Russia, I think it would redouble the commitment that, the perception that this is an absolutely illegitimate regime that can't be allowed to survive in the long term. And who knows what Putin or other senior officials actually think about that. The behavior and some of the statements they've made over the last 6 months to a year, really trying to, I think, signal that they don't perceive this as a low threshold activity, that they still believe that the use of nuclear weapons is for the existential survival of the state. I think that speaks to some awareness of the fact that that's a step that could really take them into a new level of isolation.
You mentioned there, kind of Russia's narratives about the war. Can you just give us an overview of what narrative Russia has been pushing about the war, about the invasion, and do you see those ideas actually making any kind of substantive inroads anywhere?
Well, I think they are, unfortunately, and of course there's a whole series of overlapping narratives about the moral collapse of the West and so on. I mean, just more narrowly, there's the idea that sort of a broader version of the encroaching color revolution narrative, which is the West is on a global regime change campaign. Russia's next on the list. Ukraine was being drawn into Western security institutions to give the West more. And so that this is all a product of Russia's defense against an encroaching ideological assault from the West. And I think in its pure form and in the sense of Russia as being a legitimate defender, it may not be established. But I think in the context of long-term views of Western hypocrisy, I mean, when Michael describes the the Russian plan is, I forget the word you used, but crazy or something like that.
Lunatic was the technical
Lunatic. I mean, you know, the lunatic idea of we have a regime we want to overthrow, so we're going to do a lightning campaign to rush to the Capitol, put in leaders that we have chosen, and be able to leave fairly quickly in a short period of time. That sounds rather familiar. And, you know, for a lot of the world, again, the idea is, now, I do not think they're morally equivalent, just to be clear. But for a lot of the world, it's, you know, so all of these pieces of narrative that fundamentally stem, and not only from the hypocrisy, but obviously from Iraq, from 2008, from the Trump era, from, I mean, originally pandemic, although that's now, I think, given China's problem, softened a bit. There is this sense of the theological style claims of post-Cold War American foreign policy, that we are the advocates of the norms, and we will tell you what's right and what isn't. We have to build a foreign policy on a more nuanced approach to that. So I think, although if you really drilled into it and got people in a classroom in Brazil and say, this is what Russia believes, do you agree? I think eventually you'd run out of agreement on that. But the larger sense of alignment and taking sides and that fundamental drive in foreign policy, I think that's where the spirit of their narrative is hitting home, even if some of the details are not.
So, Michael, as we gradually approach the end of our session, I want to ask you to get out your crystal ball, if I may. There's obviously been, for very good reason, a lot of focus on what Ukraine looks like at the end of the war, on Ukraine's economic needs for reconstruction, on needs for justice and accountability, on its potential membership of the EU and NATO. But I have seen comparatively little discussion of what Russia will look like. And that's not to say that Russia is going to need or is entitled to anything from the West, but Russia will presumably remain the largest country in the world, a nuclear power. Once Finland joins NATO, its borders with NATO are actually going to double. It's going to be a country we're going to have to deal with in some capacity. But what do you see Russia looking like once this war is over, and what role will it play in the world in that scenario?
Well, I would say two things in response, and they're both rather depressing. But that's the usual mode for us Russia watchers. So it just comes sort of naturally. I think that it's very difficult for me to envision, though I would like to. It's very difficult to envision Russia overcoming Putinism for the foreseeable future. So obviously Putin is mortal, and there are ways in which he could be pushed from power. But Putinism, which is to say some rather authoritarian form of governance in Russia that is built on the pillars of military and security services, it just feels to me like that's there to stay. I mean, there isn't a viable opposition movement. It's not institutionalized. There certainly are no political parties in Russia, and it's just very, very difficult for me to imagine. I could imagine a Tahrir Square in Moscow, certainly, but I couldn't imagine it sticking. And I think that those institutions will sort of come back and reclaim power if they're put under threat. So I think that that's very significant in terms of projecting any kind of future Russian foreign policy. It's to say that the lines that Putin has established for the country, in a way unsuccessful as they are probably lines that are here to stay. And sort of from that, you can extrapolate, I think, a second point, that the decoupling of Russia from the West, which is Putin's choice, and is not something I think 90% of Russians would have voted for before the war, is going to be profound. And it's going to be profound for Europe, and it's going to be profound for Russia. A kind of wall is going to go up. And just the divergence between those two places, Europe and Russia, is going to be remarkable. And I think that was not necessarily predictable or foreseeable before the 2022 war. That's one of the consequences of the war. But you can take the point even further. You can kind of radicalize the point that there will be a state of semi-war between Russia and Europe, not just Russia and Ukraine, but semi-war between Russia and Europe probably for decades to come, if I'm right about the first point, right? If Putinism is here to stay, and the conflict is what it is, neither side is going to be able to completely win the conflict, and so that's really something to live through, what we've lived through over the course of the last 12 months. And it will mean that Russia will be sort of militarized and on this kind of footing for a very long time to come. And Europe will be having to grapple with a kind of militant Russia also for a very long time to come. So I think we stand at the threshold. It's not that we're sort of 1 year out and there's the possibility of going back. We stand at the threshold of both a new Europe and a new Russia that will, to a degree, be defined by the common antagonism that they have for each other. I've left the U.S. out of the picture, but we can save that for another panel.
You paint an extraordinarily bleak picture, but this is a question I've been asking a lot of people recently, and their answers are equally bleak, I'm afraid to say. You mentioned at the beginning that the failure of sanctions has been one of the major stories of the past 12 months. In part, Russia has been able to weather. I mean, these are unprecedented sanctions, but Moscow has been able to weather them by turning, to markets in Asia, elsewhere in the world, to India. Do you see them being able to build and deepen those ties in the coming years to survive that isolation, that kind of deep freeze that it's going to be in with Europe and the kind of broader Western world?
I don't see why they wouldn't be able to sort of sustain it. The world is a very big place, and if the drones don't work out from Iran, there might be other sources where they can be acquired. And Russia is adept at sort of working around legal structures and has lots of experience since 2014 when it sort of evaded the first round of punitive sanctions. We do want to think back, from a DC perspective and look at the sanctions regime from 2014 to 2022 and think back to the initial objectives. As a former State Department person, I remember them very well. They were to get Crimea back into Ukraine and to expel Russian soldiers from eastern Ukraine. So I think we have to look back with sobriety at that round of sanctions. Obviously now it's very different, and the stakes are higher, and the coalition is better, and the nature of the sanctions is more aggressive. And I think it will create huge problems for the Russian military machine. That's now the intention of the sanctions. But for it to change Russia's modus operandi or sort of make it impossible for Russia to run the war, I doubt that sanctions could have that degree of effect, unfortunately.
I think we only have a few more moments, and I want to kind of there's a lot to unpack in between Russia and Africa. Going back to the question of disinformation, which we discussed with Mike earlier, Moscow has been accused by the State Department of waging a massive disinformation campaign in the Middle East and North Africa, blaming Western sanctions and Ukraine itself for the grain blockade in the Black Sea last summer. To what extent do you see that these narratives have succeeded in making inroads?
To some extent they have, and in some very curious quarters. So if you think about the agents pushing what you might call the Russian agenda in Africa right now, they are religious figures, right? Leaders of churches, leaders of mosques. It's very interesting because part of the message Russia is sending out is, look, the West doesn't honor its values. Oh, by the way, it's decadent. It promotes sexual immorality, LGBTQ. All these things are not just decadent, they're profoundly un-African. Why would you go with a civilization that is in decay, which is very interesting that we'll be talking about Russia in decay? Why would you do that? This sort of, it's music to the ears of very conservative religious leaders who do not necessarily understand, where Russia is coming from. So to that extent, that messaging has been successful.
Akriti, as you are from the Stimson Center, I will follow in Alex's shoe steps and give you the final word as the home team. With the anniversary, it's incredible that it's been a year already, but with the anniversary of the invasion next week, how do you see the next year playing out in terms of, Russia's relations both in South Asia but also with the wider world? Do you think they're going to be able to keep deepening those ties, or are there going to be roadblocks, and what do you see those roadblocks looking like?
I think it really depends on what happens with the war. It really depends on what Russia's position is going to be, a year out or 2 years out or 3 years out. And I think the discussion is what ability Russia has to play any role, right? Like if you think about South Asia, one of the roles that Russia's played is to be involved as a party in negotiations with Afghanistan. And is that going to continue? From India's point of view, one of the reasons that India started to actually ramp up its diplomacy with Central Asia is because it doesn't see Russia really playing that much of a role in the region. And so it has to think about counterterrorism. It has to think about what happens with stability and peace in the region. And so I think, like I said again, I think a lot of the conversation is going to be about what do you do to sort of keep the relationship with Russia sort of nominally going on while you find other partners to fill those gaps and fill those needs and there are many partners available from different parts of the world now.
Great. Well, it was a lot to cover in an hour, but I think we did a darn good job, if I do say so, if I may speak on our behalf. Can you please give a round of applause for our wonderful panelists?
Great. Well, thank you very much. That was a really interesting and insightful panel discussion. So thank you to all the panelists. And Amy, thank you for such a great job moderating as well. Thank you to everyone here that came to Stimson Center today, to be in our audience, to the audience at home as well. And please be sure to keep an eye out early next week for the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program. We'll be producing a short set of essays looking at some of the foreign policy assumptions